Chapter 2. The Black Sweater. Ashley followed James's instructions, her movements a mix of nervous energy and burgeoning excitement. After quickly drying her hair, she slipped into the black V-neck sweater. The soft knit material felt luxurious against her skin, a stark contrast to the growing heat within her. As she turned to face the full-length mirror, a gasp escaped her lips. The sweater, a seemingly innocent piece of clothing, had been transformed into something undeniably provocative. The deep V-neck plunged daringly low, revealing the delicate curve of her collarbone and the subtle swell of her breasts. But it was the back that truly took her breath away. The sweater mirrored the front, with a low, plunging V that revealed the smooth, bare expanse of her back, dipping down to the very top of her buttocks. The loose knit of the fabric allowed it to hang loosely, and she knew that even the slightest movement would offer a tantalizing glimpse of her bare skin. The length was equally suggestive. The sweater barely skimmed her hips, ending just an inch or so below her bottom cheeks. She tugged at the hem, trying to pull it down further, but it stubbornly refused to budge, only stretching to cover another 2 inches at best. She considered the effect, the way the soft fabric clung to her curves, highlighting the delicate slope of her waist and the gentle roundness of her hips. A thought struck her, and she deliberately let one side of the sweater slip off her shoulder, exposing the smooth, creamy skin of her upper arm and shoulder. The sweater now hung lower on that side, covering a little more of her thighs, but the trade-off was the alluring exposure of her shoulder, a silent invitation. The contrast between the dark, sensuous knit and her pale, smooth skin was striking. She turned from side to side, studying her reflection, a blush creeping up her neck. The image staring back at her was undeniably alluring, a blend of innocence and raw sensuality. The shy, hesitant girl she usually saw in the mirror had been replaced by a woman radiating a quiet confidence, a woman ready to embrace the night's unknown possibilities. A wave of nervousness washed over her, the reality of James's request sinking in. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, the cool metal a stark reminder of the world outside. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and turned the knob. The cool night air brushed against her bare legs as she stepped out of her apartment, the door clicking shut behind her. Ashley held her breath, hoping against hope that the elevator would arrive quickly and empty. The thought of encountering any of her neighbors, especially in her current state of dress, sent a wave of anxiety through her. Most of the building's residents were elderly, and she dreaded the thought of their shocked or disapproving glances. But then, her mind drifted to Mr. Eliot. He was a 55-year-old widower, a resident of the 18th floor, and a man whose lingering gazes and clumsy attempts at flirting always made her uncomfortable. She'd often caught him staring a moment too long, his eyes following her as she turned away, leaving her with an unsettling feeling. She prayed silently, "Please, not Mr. Eliot." The elevator doors finally dinged open, and her heart sank. Standing inside, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance, was Mr. Eliot. He looked her up and down, a slow, appreciative scan that made her skin crawl. A smirk played on his lips as he held the door open, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't quite decipher. "Well, hello, Ashley," he said, his voice a low, suggestive drawl. "Going out for a night on the town?" Ashley hesitated, her cheeks burning. She desperately wanted to take the stairs, to escape his prying eyes, but he insisted. "Please come in," he insisted, his hand gesturing towards the open elevator. "Wouldn't want you waiting all night." Reluctantly, she stepped into the elevator, her movements stiff and awkward. She turned around, facing the doors, her back now exposed to Mr. Eliot's gaze. The close proximity, the knowledge that he was watching her, sent a shiver down her spine. The act of pivoting, of presenting her back to him, felt like a deliberate, humiliating display. She could almost feel his eyes tracing the contours of her body, the curve of her back, the bare expanse of her legs. A strange sensation washed over her, a confusing mix of embarrassment, vulnerability, and a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite name. The combination of emotions, the thrill of being watched, the forbidden nature of the situation, sent a strange warmth spreading through her. A dampness bloomed between her legs, a physical manifestation of the conflicting feelings swirling within her. The elevator crawled downwards, each passing floor an agonizing eternity. Ashley's senses were heightened, acutely aware of Mr. Eliot's presence behind her. She could practically feel his gaze burning into her back, and she sensed him shifting, subtly moving closer, angling himself to peer into the deep V of her sweater. The thought of him glimpsing the bare skin of her backside, of him realizing she wore nothing beneath the sweater, sent a wave of mortification through her. She desperately wanted to say something, to break the suffocating silence, but the words caught in her throat, trapped by a knot of anxiety. She was locked in a battle with herself, a confusing mix of disgust at Mr. Eliot's leering gaze and the unwelcome, undeniable thrum of arousal that pulsed between her legs. The dampness there was growing, a shameful testament to her body's betraying response. A desperate, irrational thought flickered through her mind. If only more people would get on, he wouldn't dare do anything. She clung to that hope, praying for a reprieve. The elevator doors slid open, and her heart plummeted. A small group of elderly men, neighbors from the building, stood waiting to enter. Ashley froze, her breath catching in her throat. This was not the reprieve she had hoped for. The group of elderly men, their faces flushed and voices boisterous, surged towards the open elevator doors. The smell of stale alcohol wafted into the small space, and Ashley's heart pounded in her chest. This was her worst nightmare realized. Hey, what's this?" One of the men slurred, his eyes widening as he spotted Ashley. "A little party going on? Room for a few more, huh?" Another chuckled, nudging his companions. "Hold on, fellas," Mr. Eliot said, his voice surprisingly firm. He stepped forward, effectively blocking the doorway. "This elevator's full. Full. There's plenty of room," a third man protested, pushing forward. "We're just going down to the lobby." "I said it's full," Mr. Eliot repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll have to wait for the next one." "Come on, Eliot, don't be a spoilsport," one of the men grumbled, but they reluctantly stepped back. The elevator doors slid shut, and Ashley let out a shaky breath, a wave of relief washing over her. She turned to Mr. Eliot, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I appreciate that." "Don't mention it," he said, a small self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Wouldn't want you getting crowded, especially when you are dressed so elegantly." His eyes lingered on her exposed back, and a flicker of his earlier leering gaze returned. Ashley's cheeks flushed, a mix of embarrassment and reluctant gratitude. She still felt the uncomfortable weight of his gaze, but she couldn't deny that he had, in a way, protected her. "Really, thank you," she said again, her voice a little stronger this time. "Any time, Ashley," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, suggestive murmur. "Especially for a beautiful woman like you." Ashley blushed, a nervous habit that always seemed to betray her. She reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of her neck. The gesture, though innocent, seemed to draw Mr. Eliot's attention even more, his eyes following the movement with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. The elevator doors slid open, and Ashley stepped out into the cool night air. A wave of relief washed over her as she finally escaped the confined space and Mr. Eliot's intense gaze. She stood outside the apartment building. The city's ambient noise, a stark contrast to the stifling silence of the elevator. In the whirlwind of emotions, she had completely forgotten to arrange a ride to James's apartment. She pulled out her phone, the cool metal a comforting weight in her hand. The night was crisp, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees lining the street. The cool air against her bare legs and arms sent a shiver through her, a stark reminder of how little she was wearing. The thin knit of the sweater offered minimal protection against the chill, and she couldn't help but feel exposed, vulnerable. A strange, almost primal urge washed over her, a desire to touch herself, to feel the dampness that had bloomed between her legs. But with the streetlights casting long shadows and the faint possibility of someone passing by, there was no way to do so discreetly. Mr. Eliot emerged from the building, his eyes immediately finding her. "Need a ride, Ashley?" he asked, his voice smooth and suggestive. "Oh, no, thank you," she replied quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched. "I'm just going to call a ride." "At this hour?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "It could take a while. And you wouldn't want to run into those gentlemen again, would you?" He gestured towards the building's entrance, where the faint sounds of the rowdy men could still be heard. Ashley hesitated. He was right. She didn't want to risk encountering them again, especially alone and dressed as she was. The thought of waiting for a ride, exposed to the elements and potentially encountering those men, sent a shiver of unease through her. She glanced at Mr. Eliot's car, a sleek, dark sedan parked at the curb. The idea of being alone in a car with him, dressed in nothing but a sweater, made her uneasy. But the alternative seemed even less appealing. She weighed her options, the conflicting emotions swirling within her. Finally, she made a reluctant decision. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I'll take you up on that."